I appreciate that information. So I guess we'll get started here. It is 5:31. I'd like to call to order the Finance Committee, Thursday, May 14th. I'm going to do roll call and then we'll move on. So myself, present, Mr. Salgado, Mr. Hoffman,
Present.
Mr. Gurl,
Present.
Mr. Fiducia. I don't think he's on yet. Mr. Schultz,
Here.
Mr. McDonald.
Here.
Let the record reflect, we do have quorum. Is there anyone, Mr. Chapman, that signed up for a public comment?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Then we will skip and admit public comment and move on to item D, which is an ordinance to modify 2019 property tax year late tax penalties. Can I get, so here's the question that I have. I know that we've talked about a draft, so I'm thinking it's still a draft. Mr. Arena nod head, so we'll open up for discussion and then we'll move forward. So I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Arena to kind of talk a little bit about the ordinance that was attached or just recently submitted to us earlier, about an hour ago or 2 hours, I want to say. So Mr. Arena, do you want to commentary, and then we can have open discussion dialogue and then move forward?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this draft incorporates some of the ideas that were discussed last time. I think in particular, we made it clear in there that these are only, these taxpayers are only those that are not paying out of escrow. So all the escrow payments should be made as they normally would be. You were given two versions. This morning, the State's Attorney's Office had sent out an update, and I had 2 points in there that I wanted this committee to consider and provide feedback on. So in one of the versions that you were given, there's 2 highlighted sections. In that, the first highlighted section states that with respect to any payment of the June 19th, 2020 installment of real estate taxes made after October 15th, 2020, the statutory interest penalty shall be incurred retroactive to June 19th, 2020. So the question I had asked the state's attorney is, do we want to impose that penalty if somebody just is still struggling at that point and fails to make the payment? And the state's attorney feels that that should, Mr. Kurlinkus felt that that should remain in there because otherwise, he said there's no incentive for people to make the payment. In my mind, I thought the incentive would be that the amount is going to be sent to the tax sale. He also pointed out that the tax buyer would then, I guess normally the tax buyer is if those penalties are added in, the tax buyer is paying them. And in this case, then if we were not to include that, the tax buyer would not be paying it. So I guess. So
basically, if I could just add to that, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, go ahead.
Basically, since the tax buyer to tax sale has to pay all prior delinquent taxes, if they're not made retroactive, that person who is purchasing at the tax sale would really be benefiting from someone who has lost their home because they couldn't pay the taxes. And so that was our input legally, you know, to
Sure.
your committee and for the county board.
Sure. Mr. Arena, do you want to continue on with the other items just so we can then open up discussion?
And the other item is in paragraph B, number 1, it says in there that this is defining who is eligible. First criteria is that the applicant's source of income was from a business that was not identified as an essential business under the governor's order. or was from an essential business that was financially disadvantaged by the COVID-19 disaster. I questioned whether we want to have that second element there, what or was from an essential business that was financially disadvantaged. I felt that that would lead to disputes. The first part of that is pretty clear cut, whether it's identified in the governor's order or not as an essential business. But if you're opening this up to any essential business that was financially disadvantaged, I think that could lead to disputes. A person could come back and say, well, you know, I was disadvantaged, you said I was not. So I just questioned whether that's a good idea. Now, keep in mind, to qualify, these first set of circumstances have to exist, but they also have to have had applied for assistance and have been denied. So maybe that's the more important criteria, and we don't need to focus so much on this. Again, these 2 points were just questions I raised, and I think that they're important enough that, you know, I alone shouldn't be making a determination here. I think it requires the input from this committee to do so. The
Sure.
last item that was discussed the last time we met on this issue was the percent of the partial payment, and we settled on 25%. I know I had talked at the last meeting that possibly doing it in 3 payments, but Mr. Kerlink has pointed out to me that the statute doesn't permit dividing it into 3 payments like that. You could divide it into 2 payments, which is essentially what we've done, 25% up front, or 1/8 of your total tax bill, and the second portion of that that you pay in full at a later date. Although the treasurer is accepting partial payments, so I guess we also have to talk about that, and if people are making periodic payments throughout this period of time, is that an issue at all? So those are the key points that were addressed in this new draft from the draft that we last discussed.
Okay, just real quickly, Mr. Arena, if you wouldn't mind, I know you covered sections that were kind of talked about, but if you could just walk us through essentially what that process would mean based on this ordinance. I know you touched on the 2 items of qualification, et cetera, but just a brief, quick summary for those that haven't had much input between or discussion between this committee and outside of the committee. So just real quick, within like 2 minutes or so, if you could just kind of walk us through an example so we know what the application of this ordinance would look like.
Sure thing. So a taxpayer who is unable to pay their first payment of property taxes due June 19th would submit an application, and in that application they would provide documentation of their source of income and whether or not they had applied for either unemployment benefits or aid through the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. So they've applied for assistance. They're providing documentation that they were denied. They're documenting what their business was, the nature of their business. That application would be submitted to the clerk's office. The clerk would then transfer that application to the auditor. The auditor will vet the applications and determine if they meet the criteria, and if they don't, they would deny it. If they do meet the criteria, then they would grant it, and it's also contingent on that taxpayer paying 25% of the tax that was due. And this only applies to the first installment. It does not apply to the second installment.
Okay. Anyone have any questions for discussion, or Ms. Height-Ross or Mr. Kalinkas?
Yes, if I could just
Yes.
add to what Mr. Arena said. So what I had asked Mr. Kurlinkus to do, which will be disseminated, is to provide a sample application. There were questions at the last meeting regarding how simplistic this process would be for taxpayers who wanted to avail themselves of this should you pass this ordinance. And so what we would have is basically a one-page document. It would have all of the criteria in simple language for the applicant and would clearly state you must meet all of the criteria, and it would be listed out by numbers. Basically now in the current draft, there's 4 criteria, but whatever criteria you determine you want would be listed out, and then the applicant would have to sign under penalty of perjury that all of that information was in fact true and applicable to them. So the process would be that simple, just a one-page application for those who would want to avail themselves of this.
Sure. Any question, Mr. Arena?
I also had reached out this morning to Gus Gettner just to ask if it would be difficult to put the application online, and he said it would not be. He felt it would be a simple process. So, you know, whatever application we create, we can have the option of them just applying online.
Thank you. Any questions for discussion, please? Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Chairman. I guess my question is about the unemployment, paragraph B, section 1 and 2 there, where it defines the criteria that one must meet. After 1, it says, and the applicant was denied unemployment benefits or was denied relief through the CARES Act. So my question is, let's say someone who is a taxpayer, can't make ends meet, was granted unemployment, but their unemployment is such that it is much lower than what they were making before. That would basically, you know, to where they can't pay. So would we say that, you know, once you got unemployment, you wouldn't be eligible for this because you got unemployment benefits? But what if those benefits were a lot less than what the person was making before? Should we, you know, is that a question that we should be asking ourselves, if that needs to be in there, or just the mindset behind that, if you could, Mr. Arena?
Well, there was concern, you know, that if we just open this up to everyone, it would be abused, I guess. So we tried to create criteria that was clearly defined. I agree with you, Mr. Gurl, that those people might deserve some relief as well. I just don't know. I guess I was looking, where we're at now is somewhat of a compromise in terms of what we're offering. And I guess that compromise is based on, our, you know, the financial impact to the county by doing this. I'm told that we collect approximately $700,000 in interest on people who don't pay on time. The treasurer has told me that 12,000 people typically don't pay on time. So, so I guess I'm not, I don't have the opinion that we should not, you know, expand it to other people. I think, though, every step we take expanding it makes it more difficult to determine whether or not somebody's qualified. The more discretion we're placing in the hands of the auditor just opens it, you know, up to more of these rejections that could become disputed.
Right. And if I may add, I don't know from a legal standpoint, I don't know, the state's attorney could maybe answer this, but I think it could potentially open us up for, you know, some disputes of lawsuits. Potentially, I'm not saying that that's the case, but hey, I was discriminated because, you know, I didn't get the privilege of granting the application because X, Y, and Z. I don't know if that's a strong argument or not, or something that would be addressed. I'm not saying that that's the main reason, but it does, I think, whether if you're denied unemployment, you know, from my perspective, I mean, we know that taxes are coming due on an annual basis. I mean, we sort of, I guess I'm just saying from standpoint of if it's $3,000, $2,000, half of it, $1,000 a payment or whatever, $500, you know, paycheck to paycheck kind of type of deal. That's another thing. But I think it just more of a, to meet that criteria, I'm assuming, I don't know, I'm not talking to Mr. Arena, but the logic under why it came that way. But it is a valid point. You know, some people could get less unemployment than others that qualify. So, you know, on that aspect of it. But I would assume from a legal standpoint, you know, it kind of gets a gray area, and then, you know, assumptions are made or presumptions, and you, I guess, don't want to do that because then people will, I don't know, complain about it, you know, or whatever the case may be, and it just draws more attention, potential litigation. I'm assuming. I don't know if that's the correct answer on that aspect of it. But yes, Mr. Girl, go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman. Maybe if we can just add some language in there, if the applicant was granted unemployment benefits and possibly receive some money from the CARES Act, they would still have to show financial hardship just like anyone else, so that we wouldn't, let's say, eliminate a certain group of people. I'm just saying that I think that language could be put in there, maybe another paragraph, and instead of "and" you could have "or" in there. I'm not sure, I'm not the attorney, but it just up for discussion. So my 2 cents. Thank you, Chairman.
Yep.
If I could just
Yeah, Ms.
respond.
Ross, and then we'll go Mr. Schultz. Yep. Go ahead, Ms.
Okay, so at our last meeting, I just said, whatever you decide, you have to make sure that you are treating everyone similarly situated the same, to answer your question. So, you know, if the goal is to give relief to taxpayers who have been financially impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, who cannot afford to pay their taxes on time, then you have to keep that in mind when you are listing criteria.
Thank you, Ross. Mr. Schultz, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just in terms of the getting a benefit from the CARES Act, I believe that the $1,200 per person was a part of that, and that pretty much everybody got that under any category whatsoever. So I don't know if that is a helpful part. And the other comment would just be, if there were 12,200 people that, you know, didn't pay their taxes on time in the last cycle, then we could reasonably anticipate that that would be a significantly higher number during this period that we're talking about. And my concern in regard to that is that the administrative burden of navigating the number of applications that would be coming would be very substantial.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Anyone else discussion on this topic? Yes, go ahead, Mr. Girl.
Thank you, and I'll make it brief. Has anyone spoke to the auditor to see if he can handle 12,000 applications or more?
Yeah, Mr. Arena. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I've talked to him several times. He's aware of the number. I think when we had that conversation, we had this narrow focus on people who had been denied assistance and people whose business was just not a non-essential business. So it was clearly closed down by the governor's order. And under that criteria, he felt comfortable being able to process the applications. I don't think that, you know, he feels that 12,000 people who pay late are going to be qualified. So I've talked to him more than once about it. I've talked to the treasurer several times about it. You know, when we first discussed this, I talked to Clerk Gumau about allowing the applications to be submitted through her office and flow to the auditor. I guess realistically, if we're getting applications submitted online, that's kind of a formality. I think it would just electronically be transferred. But I've tried to engage all the people who would be involved, so.
All right. Any other questions, comments on this discussion? Mr. Kelly?
Thank you, Chairman. Just an observation. I think given the administrative costs that'd be involved in the applications and process of determining who might qualify, it might be better off just across the board to do one thing for everybody and eliminate all that administrative cost.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Any other questions, comments on this topic? Seeing none, I do would like to ask Mr. Kurlinkus if he's on the line from parliamentary procedure, what needs to be done, because I believe the 19th, Mr. Arena, of June is somewhere the first payment. So I'd like to, a sense, get a handle on where we're at, what needs to be done next, and because I know that there's an impact on potential tax bodies potentially, that we probably need to send out a press release and ensure that they have their questions answered if they have any concerns with this. So I don't know if Mr. Kurlinkus is on the line, if he wouldn't mind
He is.
giving us
Chairman.
some knowledge on how to proceed essentially,
Thank
and ensure we're on track.
Sure, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I've discussed this with Mr. Arena in some detail. I think the best thing to do would be to send out a press release and to indicate what we're trying to do. And by the way, you should be receiving, as soon as I get done talking here, I'll finish up adding the emails. I've got a draft of the application, and it is simply a draft, so please, bear that in mind. But I think that the idea would be, and this is what Mr. Arena and I had discussed, is to have to target next Thursday, a week from today, for a finance committee meeting, to put out in the press release what we're trying to do on this procedure, and then go ahead and solicit from the taxing bodies, preferably by email, any questions or concerns that they would have regarding the process going forward on this, so that those could be then discussed, Chairman, at the next Finance Committee meeting, with the idea that if we can get all of that done and accomplished, that 2 weeks from tonight on the 28th, you would be then, we would have a finalized version of the ordinance that you saw tonight, with a finalized version of the application to be voted on 2 weeks from tonight. That would be what I would anticipate would be the procedure.
Okay. Sounds good. With that, any other questions, comments? Seeing none. Okay, so that we'll move forward with that and try to get a press release out there. Mr. Arena will work together on this just to make sure with the state's attorney, so we get everything in line and we're prepared. So then we can either vote up or down, essentially, this process, and then move it forward. So so we don't tie into the payments issue there. Any other matters before the county this committee?
Chairman,
Yes, go ahead.
say one other thing. I'm
Yes.
going to send out, when I hit send here, and I'm working from my home computer, so
Sure.
I'm trying to get the email addresses on here. I think I've got everybody on board here that I can see attending on the meeting. If for some reason you don't get a copy of this application that the state's attorney was kind enough to make an excuse for me not having it ready, this draft, let me know, because like I said, I'm working kind of off of two different screens here. So, but I'm gonna hit send now. You should receive that momentarily to your WinCoil mailbox.
Thank you, Mr. Kurlinkus, and we'll be looking forward to that. Mr. Fiducia, you had your hand up real quick. You're on mute, Mr. Fiducia.
How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know, I excuse my tardiness. one of the things that I wanted to bring up, that probably we should have a joint meeting with personnel and policies would be, we discussed with the raises for the elected officials. I don't know if you've covered that already, but
Not yet.
it's something you and I need to discuss
Absolutely.
and probably bring it before a joint committee. So I'd like you to entertain that thought for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll touch base with Mr. Chapman and get it on the next week's agenda. So we can go ahead, either a joint and then a finance committee as well on that topic. So we'll move forward with that next
Thank
week.
you, sir.
All right. Any other matters? Seeing none, can I get a motion to adjourn? Mr. Gurl, Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Schultz, thank you. All in favor, signify by saying aye or raise your hands, whichever.
Aye. Both.
Thank you. We are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll get going here in just 1 second. Okay, we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. I do not have any agenda updates at this time. With that, I will go to Mr. Schultz for the invocation. We will ask everybody to remain seated for the invocation and pledge, if that's okay. Mr. Schultz?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear God, we approach you tonight with confidence because you have handled the thing that is most important for our destiny, for our eternity, by sending Jesus to the cross to carry our sin and to pay the penalty for what we should have had to pay for, and we're grateful for that. I'm mindful of those that are suffering in our community because of this virus or because of other ailments, or because they have families or friends that have either died or have gotten very sick. And my heart and my mind, and I know those of my fellow board members, go out to them tonight. I pray for your care and your comfort for those that have suffered a great loss. I also am thinking about those that have lost their jobs and those businesses that are closed right now, and those financial burdens that are being carried, as well as the emotional and mental burdens that are being carried by those that can't go to work because that's not available to them. I pray that you'll help those families. I pray that you'll provide for their needs. And I do ask, God, that you'll help us to be able to open soon in a way that protects people, but also allows for people to earn a livelihood and be able to pay their bills. So I'm asking for your comfort, God. I'm asking for your healing. And we trust you with this. We know that you care about us, but we also need your help. In Christ's name, amen.
We'll now do the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much, Mr. Schultz. Our next item, briefly, I just want to give a quick update. I see we have Dr. Martell is on the line, so I'll give her the opportunity to provide any updates she'd like to offer. Oh, I think I skipped the roll call, didn't I? I think I see our clerk waving me down to call on her for the roll call. I skipped the entire section. Clerk Gama, you're up. I apologize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now we will proceed with the roll call. Mr. Booker.
Here.
Mr. Butita.
Here.
Mrs. Crosby.
Here.
Mr. Fellers.
Here.
Mr. Fiducia.
Here.
Mr. Girl.
I am here.
Mrs. Gorel.
Present.
Mr. Hoffman.
Present.
Mr. Kelly.
Here.
Mr. McDonald.
Here.
Mr. Neighbors. Mr. Neighbors is absent. Mrs. Red.
Present.
Mr. Salgado.
Present.
Mr. Schultz.
Here.
Mr. Tassoni.
Present.
Mr. Webster.
Here.
Mr. Westcott. Mr. Westcott is absent.
No, he's here.
He's on the line.
He needs to unmute.
Okay, but he is here.
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Arena.
Here.
Mr. Billich.
Here.
Okay, I understand I only have Mr. Neighbors is absent. That's the only board member absent. All right,
Okay.
one absent, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Sorry to get out of the sequence there. My apologies. So we'll move on then. Before, I do believe we have a gentleman for public comment we'll get to in just 1 minute. Before that, we have a little update on the COVID response. I would just say this, when we last spoke, since we last spoke, a couple things. The governor came out with his reopening plan, put everybody, all of the regions in the state in category 2, phase 2, and to move from phase 2, where we're at now, to phase 3, where some more things would open up, like retail with social distancing as probably one of the more notable examples. And to be able to get together in groups of 10 or less, you have to meet certain public health metrics. Right now, we are on track to move from phase 2 to phase 3 based on hospital capacity, as we've been reporting out through the health department the last month and a half, and based on percentage of positive tests. We're on track. That doesn't mean things couldn't change, but we're making good progress there. Had a meeting with a bunch of the mayors today, talking about there's some work groups that have been put together, and there's some talk about how to best open up as we go forward, making sure we're balancing public health with the obviously the shared concern of opening business up where it makes sense. So a lot of good discussions around those topics. I do see that Dr. Martell's with us. I'll turn things over to her, and then we can take any questions if we can, because we have a full agenda. We'll keep it to a shorter discussion than maybe we did a couple of weeks ago when we really hammered through a bunch of outstanding topics. Dr. Martell, go ahead.
Well, I think, Chairman, thank you for that. And I think everyone has probably had a little bit of chance. I'm hopeful that you sent out the Restore Illinois and Rockford region rebounding. As the Chairman has indicated, the Restore Illinois plan puts us in what's called the North Central region. But the public health metrics we look to go, we're currently in what's called phase 2 or flattening, with the idea being that we're going to have to learn how to coexist with COVID, right? We're going to have to begin to bring things back on in a way that we can monitor and manage the metrics, identify any outbreaks, and promptly respond. But we want some of the ideas, the number of new cases is declining over the last 14 days. And we talked about that last time as being an incubation period. Positivity rate below 20%. Our hospital admissions, Chairman talked about that, and that the hospitals have to maintain a capacity for at least 14% of their ICU beds, med-surg beds, and ventilators in the event that there is a surge in cases. The other thing is looking at sufficient, personal protective equipment, and I know that you considered that a couple of meetings back when that was out there. We had to be able to get that for our long-term care facilities and some of our first responder community areas. And the other thing is diagnostic testing within 24 hours, and I think our population has really grasped onto the concept of testing. As of today, we were reporting over 13,000 tests have been done. And I think that becomes very important to understand. About just under 5% of our population has been tested, and we're running a positivity rate around 15% at this point. As of today, and again, I don't want people to get hooked up on the number of confirmed cases, because that is reflective right now of the results we're getting back from the community-based testing site at the University of Illinois location. And I think everyone is very much aware right now there was a problem with the lab that the state of Illinois contracted with at this site in Rockford and one in Aurora. And they have been basically working to get us out the results. I said I would take on all the results here, just get them to me. And we have been calling every day. We call at least, to date we've called 1,500 from the time we've gotten results. We just got off a phone call with them about the remaining results. So it's a yeoman's task to call, but we really think that this is important to understand. It has not significantly changed our positivity rate, which I think is important to understand, but it has changed the total number of reports. So, one day you saw 200. I want people to make sure that they're delving into that report to understand that we are explaining that it is not a peak. Now, of course, when you hear in the national and federal news that they saw that peak and thought that something had gone on there, but of course, they don't reach out to a local to really understand what's going on. The number of deaths is at 39, and we indicated that about 2/3 of those are coming out of congregate settings, and the other third are not. So we are, continuing to monitor that as well. And so, again, as we look through moving to the phases, we understand that we will continue to get cases. And there will continue to be some level of death that we are not, nobody wants anyone to die prematurely, but we're going to have to really be monitoring that. But as we move through this, as businesses reopen and really restore for the region, they're really going to have to be partners with the health department to help us quickly identify if there's an exposure, what kinds of prevention things that they can be doing to protect both their workforce and the customers, to give them the confidence. We want to make sure as we move forward, that it's sustainable. And I think that becomes very important. We don't want rapid opens and, having to do another shutdown again. We've heard from our restaurants. We've been working a lot with them as they get ready to take a look at what can they do to maintain this concept of social distancing. What are they going to do in different practices to make sure that it's really reduces the risk of transmission, recognizing that we're probably going to have to live with this for a while until there's a vaccine or an effective treatment. So the various work groups have already started up. I know the funeral directors have been very proactive. We've gotten some things. We know the Archdiocese put out their plan, very thoughtful. And if you look, you can see that their phased approaches are really looking at that to make sure that there isn't a sudden bump or increase in number of cases. I know that the Real Estate Transaction Group has also put out some guidance for how to safely, conduct real estate transactions and showings and things like that during this time frame. In addition to, we're looking at child care sectors, right? We need good and summer programs for children over the summer months because we want to be able to begin to prepare children to return to school, given the fact that we're going to have to coexist with COVID-19. Hospitals began elective procedures earlier this week, and many of the dental practices have also started with some resumption of services. So that's a brief overview. Our daily report is intended to give you the reflective of the metrics that the state is currently looking at in terms of us within a region, but important to report it from a local perspective. You're always welcome to ask me any questions. I appreciate it. I don't want to take up too much time. I know there's a lot of other items on the agenda.
Is everybody receiving that daily report from the health department? I think there's an email to the board that's pretty consistently going out. Okay, if you have any problems getting that, yell. Mr. Arena has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Chairman Haney, you mentioned that you had a conversation with the mayors. I want to know, is the mayor of Loves Park and the village president of McChesney Park involved in the decision-making process?
Well, the governor's order is the governor's order. But what we did actually this week was we formed, we kind of restructure may be too fine a point, but we pulled together and have invited all the mayors to 3 times a week meeting via Zoom to talk about issues. So if there's going to be detailed discussions around what comes out of like work groups or suggestions along that, it would number one be vetted by the public health side. I think we all want to make sure that we're not running to a solution that's going to endanger people's lives, but also then if there's going to be decisions around recommendations, whether that would go to the governor or otherwise, in terms of deviating from that plan, then it would run through that particular group, yes. The mayor of Loves Park, the mayor of McChesney Park were involved in the discussion today.
So this real estate transaction group, right? There's an example. I assume real estate transactions would include apartment rentals. I'm not aware of, was the apartment association consulted? How are those decisions made? Like this is an example of who you're getting this input from. Who's making those decisions?
Well, the governor's order is the decision that is before us in terms of what would open up.
We're talking about local action.
Would open up now. If we're on track, that's what it is. If there's going to be a recommendation, right now we're getting feedback through these work groups. If you have feedback, share it.
Well, my question again is, I'm not familiar with all this stuff that's happening behind the scenes, and I'm trying to figure out how these decisions get made. Who is who decided we needed a real estate transaction group, and who decided who was providing input, and who makes the final determination on what we're doing locally.
May I?
No, hold on, Mrs. Gorel. Go ahead, Dr. Martell. I'll come right back to you, Angie.
Again, I don't think, okay, at this point, there were 10 working groups that were put together that looked at various procedures. So for instance, you don't see a funeral home group. They're under maybe small businesses, and what the group would do is work through a team metric to put together what their community standard is. And again, we gave guiding principles to all of the groups, and I'm sure, Chairman, you shared that document out. Every group has, a team that's been meeting together. Now, your group may have not been, but they may be looking at national guidance. They may be looking at pulling together a group to say, okay, as a community standard, this is how we're going to move forward, because you would want something being to get done differently in Loves Park than the city of Rockford, than the city, than South Beloit. And the idea being that this would be the Winnebago County community standard. And again, when we look at it from the public health metric side, for instance, if the governor's order says you can't have more than X, Y, Z in this phase, and you want to have more than X, Y, and Z, then we've got to either decide, is there a rationale that supports that we can support it and escalate it to the governor for reconsideration on that. But what we're seeing, for instance, what I've seen so far, like the restaurant establishments, Todd Marshall has been helping to co with that group. They've been formed. There are different members there are representatives from restaurants in McChesney and the Loves Park. They, gave over just kind of an overview today. They know that bar service, for instance, is not something that's, in those phases. So they were looking at, do they want to introduce it sooner? How would they introduce it sooner and safer, right? Could they make that modification? And so that's a group that's, first of all, kind of putting their best wisdoms and practices together. They're looking at guidance documents that have come out of other states as they're opening. But from the standpoint of looking at the health metrics, we're really looking to see, does it meet the guidance? So we're looking at things of hierarchy of controls in those environments, whatever that can be put into place. So at this point, we have to follow the governor's, executive order, but that doesn't mean that we can't ask for modification and put the justification on it. So the groups are making the recommendations from the business perspective. We're making sure that it's compliant with what the guidance in terms of public health for contacts, making sure that we minimize the risk of exposure, and then moving forward together as a team.
Mrs. Gorel?
I believe the realtors have taken care of their own situation like many other industries have. Gene Crosby should chime in on this. I believe that right now, even at closings, the agents are sitting in their cars and they're doing a telephone thing back and forth with their clients and the closers. Life is still going on. People, different industries are staying within the guidelines, but are still able to complete their business. Even when they go out to show houses, you can go, an agent can go in and do a virtual of the whole house while the customer is on their telephone, perhaps in their home. So, Paul, they are doing business on a daily basis, and I don't know how Gene's office is doing it, but I'm sure it's an agreement, I believe, between all the real estate offices of how they're doing businesses today. And with the apartment association, I don't know if they have an organized way of showing apartments or what their standards are and what they have placed in order to stay safe. I think each industry has to look at how they can still do business today and keep going and to keep safe. And some of this is the responsibility of the industries, not all our responsibility, or the health department, other than the health department going out and saying, yeah, you're doing it right, keep up the good work.
Thank you.
That's my comment on this. And maybe Gene would like to come in on it.
Yep. Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. I'll go to Mrs. Crosby, and there might be another hand up. Mr. Kelly, you're next. Mrs. Crosby.
Angie is right. At our closings, they're bringing the files into the parking lot. Some title companies aren't even allowing anybody in their building. They're doing all the signatures from the parking lot, all the notarizations, everything else. And there's only one state in the country that did not view our business as essential, and that's Pennsylvania. And they're really pressuring Pennsylvania to open up the real estate industry. But having said that, we're an essential service. Why? Because we're tied to banks. It's called mortgages, guys. And that's why we're an essential service. But our business has gone forward, and I am up over last year financially by a substantial amount. And it's been an excellent market, and the inventory is low, and properties are getting 4 and 5 offers at a time, guys. So it is an exceptional market right now. So, and Angie's right, we have figured it out.
So there's things that we're in now that we can do. There's things if we progress to phase 3 that we'll be able to start doing. And then there's still going to be things that are left undone. One of the things that's being talked about, obviously by restaurant folks, is whether or not restaurants could be tucked into phase 3. They're currently not included. The Restaurant Association of Illinois, by example of an association taking statewide actions advocating for 25%, opening to 25% to capacity. That does not mean it'll happen, but there's a lot of discussion around that. Local folks and state folks are sharing their opinion. We are stealing some good ideas from Wisconsin. Their state level Department of Health and their economic state group really put together good safeguards around that as one example. I'm glad to see the church aspect took a step with the Catholic Church. Obviously, it can't stop with one church. So it's very fluid. And if you have any thoughts specific to a particular sector, we can pick that up maybe offline or in a follow-up. I do need to go to Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly.
You kind of screwed me up, Frank. You distracted me and I forgot what I was going to talk about.
My fault. I'm going to come back to you when you're ready. I'm going to come back to you though. Mr. McDonald, then I see Mr. Salgado. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the efforts of Madison County, Illinois, taking the lead. I'm not as interested in being controlled by the governor. I think that we do need to make responsible steps, but I think that also maybe the governor's plan is a little bit lackadaisical. I think we can do better. I'm kind of embarrassed that the city's taking the lead that they are on taking care of this. I would hope that the county would take a more serious approach or take a good shot at it to cover the entire county, not just the city of Rockford, but to do it for the entire county of Winnebago. So I just want to get my 2 cents out there. I think I'm not as interested about sticking with what the governor says. I think we need to do what's best for Winnebago County and move forward in a responsible way.
So to your point, Mr. McDonald, just to clarify, is the work groups are inclusive of folks from around the county, involve, I believe, multiple county board members, and also Steve Chapman and folks from other areas outside of Rockford. Obviously, there's a fair amount of business in Rockford, so that's a piece of it, but have been put together with folks from around the county. There's also a ton of discussions with our business folks in, for example, Durand Pecatonica had some discussions with their folks. So that is occurring. What would be perfect is we come up with a really good plans on things we could maybe move into phase 3 that makes sense, pass public health muster, and then we can work that in with the governor. But I would also agree with you that when you stack up the Illinois plan compared to other states, our plan, that plan is a bit more conservative in its reopening cadence and that type of thing. So it's not an unfair or incorrect statement. Maybe not lackadaisical, but I would say that it's certainly, the pace of it is a little bit slower in some cases. Absolutely. And I know there's litigation going on. There's litigation where they struck down the governor's order in Wisconsin just yesterday. You are seeing litigation at the state level around the governor's order. Finally, the General Assembly is going back in session next week so that our representatives are down there around that discussion as well, just in case you missed the news on that. Mr. Salgado, you were next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I just want to follow up. I mean, this is, I saw the press release this morning come out. I don't know if you guys saw it on basically where we're at, what stage we are, and that we're working on stage 3 and formalizing some guidelines essentially with some groups within our community. I really think that that's very important that we need to lay out some guidelines. Some
lady
detail,
under the passenger seat.
reflected to, you know, based on what the governor has come out with the different stages that they have out there. I know I sent out a couple of emails going back and forth with Mr. Haney on that and Dr. Martell and having phone conversations. But I really think that, you know, as Mr. Arena, I guess, you know, kind of feels that, you know, what are these 10 groups and what are they doing? So having those guidelines to kind of formulate so it's not that they feel like they're being left out of communication whatsoever. I think that's the bottom line. I wouldn't want to decide from my perspective anything medical related, as I'm not a professional when it comes to medical of that nature. Yes, are we continually hurting businesses? Absolutely. We are, but I think if you have those guidelines, I think people will be able to adapt more and would understand and can assimilate what state we're in based on our stages. So I just encourage that dialogue, whoever it is, the groups, that we continue to push out this information. So like, for example, that the restaurant, you know, association or whatever of restaurants are putting guidelines out there of if they do go live on May 30th, July 1st, whatever that projection is, this is what they're looking at attempting to do. So everybody's aware of that situation. So I think more importantly is just putting it on paper, sending out those press releases so everybody kind of understands where everybody, and there isn't this urgency to say, hey, you know, they're punishing my business or they're punishing such and such thing because of X, Y, and Z. I just think it brings a little bit more picture to that if there's guidelines out there. So Mr. Arena kind of feels comfortable when it comes to real estate transactions that, you know, this association has all the information they have. So in case they do have any questions, they can go to those individuals and make those suggestions and have the feedback back and forth. So, but I do appreciate Dr. Martell, the chairman, and the city of Rockford and all the municipalities out there trying to work through whatever the governor has kind of handed down. And hopefully we can get through it. And I'm positive that more press releases will be coming out, more information will be coming out on the stages and where we're at and what we're trying to do to get to where we need to be. So I do appreciate their work, though. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see Mr. Kelly. Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I'm glad Mr. McDonald brought up Madison County, because I too read into what they did, and they adopted a resolution this past Tuesday night. And the Madison County's Board of Health also voted 26-2 to pass that resolution. And I know the governor is upset with them. His statement was they're putting the patrons and people at risk and in danger. But this is the governor that also released over 4,000 inmates and from prisons, and 167 of them are Class X felons. So he's a little hypocritical when he talks about putting people at risk and in danger. I'm willing to, well, I'm really unwilling to wait until May 29th, but at this point I'm going to. But the way the governor tends to dangle the carrot, he's extended and extended and extended. I don't know. I may be following Madison County's lead if we can put together a resolution that if we're not open by May 29th, I'm willing to move forward with a resolution of our own that we're going to be open May 29th. Our numbers are looking good. Everything's looking good. And that's what I'll be looking into. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Booker. I know a couple hands shot up. Mr. Hoffman, then Mr. Schultz, then I see Mr. Webster. Mr. Hoffman.
Thank you, Chairman. Am I the only one who's seen that about 2 nights ago at Rockford,
Mr. Hoffman,
Rockford, Illinois was the 9th city
Mr.
increase.
Hoffman, I'm going to have you stop your video and just do the audio. We can't hear you very well, so stop your video on the bottom left and then just do the audio, and then we'll hear you great. Can you click the bottom left, the stop
right.
video?
Where's my stuff?
Go ahead, Joe.
Got it. I look better.
Okay,
I
go
look
ahead.
much better now.
Yep.
Anyway, I was commenting on the fact. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes,
A
sir.
couple of days ago, I was commenting on the fact that I think that Rockford was the number 9th city in the United States with increased cases. And when Little Rockford shows up on a local or of a big scale like that, it kind of worries me. So I'm kind of concerned with Mr. Booker's gung-ho method of wanting to get people out there. And I think you're letting prisoners out of jail is a false equivalency to the virus. I think that sounds good on a platform, on a speech, but it's not. It's a false equivalency. So, Mr. Booker, to you.
The one thing I heard from the mayors today, collectively, everybody wants to see things open up. Mayor Rail in South Beloit, he's watching things opening up across the street in Beloit. So there is great urgency in his, but he's also saying, but we don't want to do it in an irresponsible way. The vibe I got from the mayors today, and this is the vibe I've been getting for a while, not that they would stop anybody from having a discussion at the county board level, of course, but was that if we can walk and chew gum, we want to take steps forward that are based on public health metrics so that we don't revert back and have it backfire. And the fact that we're 2 weeks from today to the end of phase 2, as it stands right now, if we stay on the public health metrics we're on, we're going to go to phase 3. The question that remains is, can we work hard? The groups are doing some work. A lot of opinions are coming in on what is not in phase 3 that should be. I think we all agree maybe we shouldn't fill stadiums full of 10,000 people as the next immediate step. Maybe there's some other things in front of that. What would make sense in giving us a little time, giving those groups a little bit of time? We're talking about people that own these businesses that are working on it. I say give them a little bit of time, and I would rather have action that's coordinated with multiple public partners and the board and our local public health professional aligned, our medical professionals. I'll give you an example. The Bishop of Rockford called the one hospital for advice on if they opened up, how would they thoughtfully do it? So intermingling public health metrics in a thoughtful way. I think there's good work going on, and we got 2 weeks before we go to that phase anyway, just so we've got the timeline down. I know there's somebody that had their hand up. I think it was Mr. Schultz. And by the way, we're at 6:35, so we can take some more questions just so you're mindful of time. Mr. Schultz.
Yeah, just a variety of things. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just I'll try to go rapid fire, but we understand that with the communities around us opening up, that is adding an immense amount of pressure on all of us. And I'm appreciative of Dr. Martell's comment in regard to living, cohabitating or coexisting with this virus. I think that's insightful. I think that is hopeful. I also believe that this isn't going to shock anybody that our risk of civil disobedience as it relates to these issues is escalating. And you're putting people in a place where they can't pay their bills, they can't feed their families. And that's not an overstatement. That is not this is a real issue. And I think we're going to have to face the fact that if we can't come forward with some hope and with some positive signals that give people the sense that, hey, they are getting us back to work, then we're going to have a significant amount of civil disobedience. The last thing I'll say is that when you concentrate the power regarding these decisions in the hands of a couple of people, then that all by itself is going to create an immense number of questions and concerns. And that's where I believe wholeheartedly that this board will be required to act unless those that have this concentration of power can put a positive story forward in regard to opening up in the very near future. Otherwise, I think this board is going to be forced to act.
Thank you very much. The biggest concentration of power is occurring in Springfield, where now they're going back into the General Assembly, will be actually assembling, and there'll be discussions down there, I think, next Wednesday. But yes, I hear you. Thank you. Mr. Webster.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I heard Mr. Booker speak on this issue the other night at a committee meeting, and I agreed with him for the most part on the things that he's saying. I heard Keith tonight, pretty much agree with Keith there too. And I think probably some of you, like myself, have been getting emails from some of your constituents, and they're very concerned about what's going on. Why can't we open some things up? Let common sense prevail. What sense does it make to have a guy working by himself in his barber shop, and he can't take one customer in there to cut his hair and, you know, make an appointment just one-on-one? If the barber agrees to do it and the customer agrees he's going to, you know, wants the haircut, you know, that was senseless to put these salons and barber shops out of business. That's essentially what they did. Right now, Illinois is number 2 in outward migration, people moving out of the state. So by these heavy-handed, I don't know, orders that we have, that's just giving people another reason to move out of the state because they're losing jobs. They're going to go to some other state where they can work, where they can get a job. And then if they like it there, then they're going to stay there. They're going to send for their family. They're all going to move out of here. And so these heavy-handed tactics, I think, are causing businesses to go out of business, and the common working man to get out of this state to find a job somewhere where he can support his family. And what Steve just told you is right along the lines that Mr. Schultz just said about civil disobedience is exactly what I've been thinking about. And civil disobedience, when it gets to a certain point, then it devolves into anarchy. And so if you have so many people that are willing to say, no, to heck with this, I'm not following that, I've had enough. I'm gonna go out, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that, I'm gonna open my business. Are you gonna come and arrest me for it there? That's what it's gonna evolve to. And because I live on the state line, I appreciate what Frank said about Ted Rail, South Beloit Mayor. I live on the state line. I see that as well. I walk across the state line there. I see people in Wisconsin, and they're doing as they normally would for the most part. Many of them are. And I don't see the cops going and arrest them or anything. And so I don't understand all this. You know, it's just, if we don't give some people some reasons for hope, every day we don't hear any good news about this. All we hear is continuing bad news. And it's going to get incrementally better. Well, I think incrementally it's got to step up the pace. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Martell, a quick question. I see that Region 2 we're in is a rather large region encompassing most of the northern third of Illinois, plus minus Chicago, of course. I'm really more curious to understand how Rockford and Winnebago County are doing as it relates to Phase 3 guidelines. Obviously, they are looking at the whole region, but how is our specific area, specifically the city of Rockford and then the county of whole, doing to meet those guidelines? Thank you.
So, thanks, Mr. Fellers. That's why we put out the daily report, and we've modified it to now include the metrics from that the state is looking at for the region. And from a local perspective, we're on track to move into the phase. As you would guess, from a regional perspective, we kind of pull down the class curve, but we don't pull it down, and we're still meeting our metrics as well.
Great, thank you. And if I could just have a follow-up, Mr. Webster, you talk about, the barber wanting one customer in there. Right now, people who are not working, businesses that are shut down often have been able to, have under the law, been able to make arrangements to not have to pay their mortgages and not have to pay rent. As soon as we reopen, and if we reopen too soon, people will start to have to pay rent again. And if customers aren't coming out, if people aren't going to go to restaurants, if people aren't going to go get their haircuts, then rent bills are going to come, mortgage bills are going to come, and there's going to be no one there to be able to pay them. While I understand everyone on this board is interested in opening up, as quickly as possible, we have to understand this is not going to, we're not looking at a V-based recovery. It's not as if all of a sudden the next month that we're going to go back to the way things were. We are on a very, very long road. It's going to take us months, if not years, to get back to where we were just 4 months ago. And if we try to do this too quickly, all we do is risk making it worse in the long run. And if all of a sudden there's a spike 3 months from now, 4 months from now, 5 months from now, people are going to stay home, and they're going to stay home even longer. And that's going to make this recovery even longer. So I, for one, am glad that the governor is taking a very measured and safe approach to this reopening. And if Wisconsin wants to go in and open up all the bars, and next thing you know, in a month they're closed again because everyone got sick, that's fine with me. We can stay home and do this the right way.
So, and I know we could talk at this one for a long time, and I know we still have board member correspondence, so I will give people the opportunity to speak. We do have a public speaker, so if you'll indulge me, since there's a gentleman that's been waiting, I'd like to move to the public comment portion of our agenda. Mr. Chapman is indicated to me. We have Brian Clark, a member of our community that is on the line with us, that has 3 minutes to address the board. And then we would immediately move back into board member comments, and we can have a little more discussion with the idea that we move into the agenda shortly thereafter. Mr. Clark, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, go ahead.
Okay. Hello, my name is Brian Clark, and just let me introduce myself. I've lived in Rockford 15 years. I'm disabled, but I do have a unit underneath me that is a rental. I agree with some of the stuff. It's been move the carrot, move the carrot. I have a tenant downstairs, and he is totally taking advantage of the situation. Not only did he have the funds to pay me at the time, I filed before the governor closed the courts. I've had over 4 court dates. I'm in possession of photographs, everything else. I just want to make it apparent that there's no resources or nowhere I can appeal what is going on. I'm told the 29th, but I've also been told March 18th, April 20th, May 18th, and now June 3rd. And basically what's going on is the police are powerless because there's a rubber stamp that goes on every incident report. I have over 15 incident reports, and this rubber stamp is simply a tenant-landlord issue. He's stolen and in possession of things from my basement, such as a $500 rug, which he's destroyed. He has basically pushed my building into condemnment. He backed up the toilet with Lord knows what, because I have to protect my contractors. I have no way of removing this individual. He's been taken to the hospital twice for psychiatric because of his behavior outside. And my water is currently shut off to the entire building. Why? Because this individual took it on himself in his little anger games. Basically, I got a guy here who is just begging for it, and that's the wrong way to do things. The court's being closed. He cut the water line on my toilet, flooded 2 furnaces. I have probably in excess of $20,000 worth of damage, and I have nowhere to turn. This has been continuing since before the courts were closed. He dances in the front yard for us. He's had as many as 9 people sleeping over, and I just wanted my representatives to know that, and also I'd like to know what group is moving on the issues in the courthouse with protecting people, and getting us back to at least a point where we have enforcement. The doctor, he mentioned just everybody running out there. I believe in some people have common sense, but I've been in the stores and I've seen people, running. The mask is meant to keep you from giving it to other people, such as my patient care that I learned in X-ray school teaches me. But yeah, you can't contain nothing if you've got all this civil disobedience. But without enforcement, without the normal recourses even put in place, there's no way that there's no fear. So if I want to, in my case, he's basically destroyed the downstairs apartment. I have no water. He's, terrorizing me and my wife on a daily basis.
Yes, Mr. Clark.
He continues to tear up the property. And I'll end with that, but I just wanted the ability to say something so that I know.
Stop it.
Mr. Clark, let's follow up. Let's follow up offline tomorrow. I really appreciate you addressing the board. Let's follow up, me and you, tomorrow. There's a number of items you hit on that I want to better understand for sure, okay?
Sure. I've distributed information to Andrew Vella, who's my attorney representing me. His hands are tied. I'm also in contact with the city of Rockford, who has tried to render some assistance. The day they're allowed to evict people, I'm going to have to leave my home too. But
thank you, Mr. Clark. You're at well past the 3. We're well past the 3 minutes. I gotta stop it at that, and I apologize for doing that, sir. But let's follow up tomorrow, and I appreciate your comments.
Okay. Please help.
Thank you very much. Be safe, sir. Thank you. Thank you again to Mr. Clark. We will move on. Board member correspondence, Mr. Girl.
Thank you, Chairman. I just want to give a get well wish to one of my constituents, Mr. Dan Campbell, lives on Santa Monica, not far from me. He suffered a stroke not too long ago. He's doing well, but I just want to send him our prayers and get well. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Girl. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to circle back to the conversation we were having about the virus response. My question that I began that conversation with was who is making these decisions? And my question was not answered. So what I'm looking for is names, a list of names. The names of the people who decided who these working groups were going to be, and a list of the names of the people in the working groups. Chairman Haney, would you send me that list tomorrow, please?
I can send you that list tomorrow at some point when it gets updated based on conversations today. It is being firmed up, I believe, actually this evening. So yes.
So isn't this work that has been ongoing?
They're also getting input and adding a few people to certain groups. So I want to send you, going into the weekend, the most updated list. I don't want to send you one that would add a few names after the fact. So I'm happy to do that.
Let's start with the list that's the they. When you say they are, that's the list I'm concerned with. Who is making these decisions? Please. As soon as
what I am not able to tell you, Mr. Arena, is who all had input onto who all went on every working group. I can tell you that several mayors had input. I do not know where every recommendation for every person that is on. There's like 120 people spread out over 10 groups. That is, I can't give you who's the they who gave input. It's like a lot of things. What I'll give you is the most updated information I have tomorrow.
Then just start with the list who created the groups. Let's start with that.
Okay. Please. Thank you. Any other board member comments?
Yes, Mr. Chairman Haney.
Hi, Angie. How are you? Mrs. Gore.
I'm doing great. And I would suggest that Mr. Arena, once he finds out who the groups are and who their leader is, that he goes to some of those meetings himself so he can personally see who's there and what they're saying. You know, people don't realize that Rockford, Illinois is the center of a hub. We have people coming into Rockford every day and leaving it because this is a place to work. But we have so many people in our own area. Dan's one of them. Dan goes out of our area and he works into other areas and then he comes home. We are a hub of people coming and going. We are not part of our unincorporated areas where they're all spread out and apart from one another. But they have to remember, many of them do work in the hub. And by doing that, they're bringing the diseases back to their areas. The sooner we all decide to follow the rules, and we'll never get that. I don't know there's ever been 100%. Because when you look at who is running these organizations, these civil protesters, take a look at who they are and what they are, and you're going to find out that many of them are paid protesters. And they're only endangering our health. They're not trying to save our health. And if the sooner we cut back and we do what we're supposed to do healthy-wise, we're going to get over this faster than everyone having a fit saying we got to do it now, got to do it now. Like little kids, they remind me of little kids. Got to have it now, got to have it now. Yeah, it's hurting all of us. There isn't any one of us. I am so tired of being closed into my house because my grandkids won't let me out. They even do my grocery shopping, and I'm climbing 4 walls. I want to get out of here. So I am begging all of you, do what you're supposed to do so I can get the heck out of my house and start going back and meeting all of you at a meeting. I want to see your faces. I want to see you personally. I want it to go back, but it'll never be normal. It's never going to be what it has been. It's time that we go forward to make our places safer for people to work. Look at down in Rochelle. How many people was laid off because the factory down there didn't take safety precautions and infected, 800 people? We have to look and see beyond our noses and what we want and how it's hurting us. It's hurting every single one of us. But do we want this to continue to be hurting everyone? Don't we want to get it over with? Do what you're supposed to do. Tell the people do what you're supposed to do and quit complaining about it so we can get it over faster. Just thank God someone didn't drop a bomb on us. Because had they done that, then where would we be? Give us the opportunity to get back on our feet. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. Was there another hand up? Mr. Billick. Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'm gonna keep mine brief now. At this stage, there's different sides that got picked on this topic, and I'm just actually gonna go into basically saying on behalf of a lot of small business owners, especially people that were business owners that are involved with the restaurant industry, all the way down to the florist shops and all the way down to barbers and salons. These are people that I typically deal with on a daily basis. These are people that reach out to me, when they come pick up food or whatever it may be. I have actually myself been working 12-hour days every day of the week. For the most part, there are a few days where I take off to spend time with my child. And the fact of the matter is that, I hear a lot of people discussing this topic in regards to opening or not opening and certain businesses that should open. One thing that I want to make abundantly clear, that from what I understood and what I heard, anyone that did make a comment on opening or maybe including certain businesses in the next upcoming phase that weren't included, which is why I believe there is certain working groups that are actually being formed that are discussing on that. I do want to actually mention in that regard that this pandemic has actually had a huge negative effect on our community, and it's actually going to be an even bigger negative effect on small business sector. There are a lot of small businesses that technically do not qualify for the SBA loan. There are a lot of small businesses that did not qualify for our grant or our loan that we actually became a part of, which originally started as a discussion about a local grant program that we were going to create, from my understanding, which then evolved into a loan, which then evolved to a loan that was tied to the SBA. So if someone didn't apply for an SBA loan or weren't able to get the SBA loan, whatever their reasons may be, they're at the stage where they're going to end up closing their shop. And these are businesses that have continuously given us a lot of sales tax revenue. At this stage, I just want to make sure that I just mentioned, we as a county, I'm begging and pleading with all of the county board members to understand that from those businesses side of things, they're not asking for a full-blown open the restaurants and open the salons and everything like that. Even having mitigated measures to make sure that they're doing what needs to be done, they're very well aware and very welcoming to that fact. So right now, currently, if you discuss it in regards to Dr. Martell and her department, every restaurant and bar is actually under a very, very big microscope. They actually look for details all the time. And Dr. Martell can go ahead and affirm this to all of you. Inspection that can go through the health department as perfect, because there's no such thing as a perfect health inspection. So for a lot of the restaurants and bars, one of the number one things that every employee is trained firsthand to do is to clean every single table before any other customer comes up, clean every single dish, every single glass. Nothing ever gets reused in the restaurant industry. Food does not get reused in the restaurant industry. Napkins do not get reused in the restaurant industry. Albeit, I've heard stories about some people that are scrupulous on that, but still, point is they're not supposed to be reused. There are guidelines that are intense guidelines that stores, box stores, do not have to follow. Clothing stores do not have to follow those guidelines. So at this stage, I just want to make sure that I mention to you all that from that side of things, I have firsthand impact on that. A lot of these small businesses have already started closing up. I actually deal with my current beer line cleaner, and he's actually informed me of multiple businesses that have closed up in the outside of Chicagoland area, and actually another beer line company that actually closed its doors because they knew that they weren't going to have enough business. So at this stage, I want to make sure that everybody understands. No one, so far from what I've heard from everyone on this board, which I appreciate and applaud every one of you during this pandemic and everyone's input. The fact of the matter is no one's asking for an open door policy and just making this an open thing. If it's to 25% of your occupancy and having them all spaced out by a certain amount, there is everyone that is more than willing to follow by those rules. And coming from a business owner that owns 2 businesses, and I get frequented about 4 times a minimum per year by the health department to inspect every little bit of it. Plus I have to pass all kind of fire inspection and every other kind of inspection to actually maintain these places. And as well as being a person that actually pays a lease on these places, I can tell you that this is going to cause a lot of a lot of the people in this industry to shut down. And like Mr. Chairman did mention, across the border, we have businesses that are competing businesses where our customer base is now fleeing that way, and they're bringing whatever happens in those places where there isn't enough mitigation going on, they're bringing whatever they are around and surrounded by here as well. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that if we're able to control our destiny as much as we can, which we never can control fully, but if we can do it the best that we can, that's a better mitigation process than allowing our residents and our communities to fail and suffer under strict laws and guidelines that stop them from making a living. And on top of that, their customer base going somewhere else where there isn't these mitigation processes, where there isn't this kind of scrupulousness, and allowing them to bring back whatever they might have picked up over there. So I just wanted to say that. I was going to save it for later, but I just want to get it out and done so we can move on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I know Mr. Billick is serving on one of the work groups as because of his work on the economic development side. Mrs. Crosby, you had a quick comment? Mrs. Crosby.
Yeah, all I want to say, guys, is the big box stores are making a killing. These guys' profits are way up. The guy that has the small business that competes with the big box stores, his doors are closed. And it is not a level playing field at all. If you want to go to Sherwin-Williams, their doors are locked, but you can go to Home Depot. And that's where the real rub comes in here. So Chaz is right, Steve's right, Jim Webster's right. This is going to really, really damage the small businessman who has very, very narrow margins and cannot compete with the big box stores on any level, but by giving superior service, and they've been cut out of the equation. So I'm not going to talk any more about that, but these guys are getting killed and it's not fair.
Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. Thank you, Mr. Billick. I don't see any other hands up. Mr. Neighbors. Mr. Neighbors.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to say this is a trying time on both sides. We could make an argument for both sides, whether to stay open or stay closed. I'm in the funeral business and I'm swamped right now, and I'm getting COVID cases, and I'm getting people that die from being stressed from being in a COVID situation. But we're overwhelmed right now, and it's understandable. Both sides of the argument are understandable. And I also want to take this time to with both sides of the argument being understandable, talk about the mental health. And I just wanted to make the board aware that we're moving forward with the mental health board in that we now have our officers elected. Marion Abadi is the president. Dick Cooner is the vice president. Danielle Angeleri is our secretary, and Dr. K. Edward Copeland is our treasurer. And we have our officers and bylaws, and we're still working hard, and it's hard to work in these circumstances, but I just wanted to let everybody know that, you know, the mental health board is still moving forward. That's all I have for this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Neighbors. I don't see any other hands up. I apologize if I'm missing somebody. Mr. Arena on a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure where would be the appropriate place in the meeting to say this, so I'm just going to do it now. I just want to give a quick update on the administrator search. They will have, the workplace will be interviewing candidates next week between 5 and 10 to pare down a list to present to the board of options. And they expect to have that list to us near the end of the month. So I just want to let everyone know that things are progressing on that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arena. With that, we'll move on to Chairman's report. I'll be brief. We've had a good conversation. Obviously, it's the topic of the day with COVID. I did send the board an email with a number of economic data points, as well as a few public health data points. Take a look at it. Some of it is global, some of it is local, but all of it is sourced from solid sources. I will say this, it concerns me at the global level when Warren Buffett, who's pretty trusted financial guy, sold all of the Berkshire Hathaway airline stock at a time when they're at 90 to 95% reduced capacity. That is a larger global phenomenon with this that is very concerning. The University of Chicago has a research institute, part of their university, and they made a claim through their modeling that they're predicting that 42% of lost jobs in our overall global economy will not, or I'm sorry, in our US economy will not come back the way they were before they were lost. So there is a major economic disruption that parallels the public health disruption. Once in 100-year, I mean, just crazy numbers of unemployment. But I did send you some data points. I don't need to read it to you. If you want more information, it's brutal facts type stuff. So take a look at it at your leisure if you're game to do that. With that, we can move on to the announcements and communications. I will ask Clerk Gummow, or I'll turn it over to Clerk Gummow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The items received below are received as correspondence.
Okay, we'll go ahead and place those on file. Thank you very much, Clerk Gummow.
Thank you.
Next item of business, consent agenda. We got 2 items tonight. We have the raffle report and we have the layover of the March 26th, 2020 minutes, April 9th, 2020 minutes, and April 14th, 2020 minutes. May I please have a motion on those? Motion by Mrs. Crosby, second by Mr. Grohl. Thank you. Item is now before the board. It includes both those 2 items, the minutes and the raffle report. Any discussion? Seeing none, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? Seeing none, we will cast a yes vote for all members present. Clerk Gummow, you obviously noted that Mr. Neighbors joined the meeting. I think he was not here at the very, very beginning. He joined some time ago, just for the record. So just wanted you to note that. We've passed that unanimously. Thank you very much. County Administrator's report. Steve, do you have anything tonight?
I have nothing tonight, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. Anything from department heads on the line? Seeing none, we'll move on to our next item, and that's standing committee reports. Mr. Salgado has several items for us from the Finance Committee. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bear with me just a second here. I'm trying to pull up my information. I had it up, but apparently it's gone away, so bear with me. All right, so the Finance Committee has 4 items today. I want to say, let's see here. Actually, yeah, four items. The first one is an ordinance authorizing the issuance of not to exceed $4 million of general obligation bonds, alternate revenue source, series 2020 A. So I move for that.
Got a motion by Mr. Salgado on ordinance number 2, the issuance not to exceed 4 million obligation bonds. We have a motion by Mr. Salgado, a second by Mrs. Crosby and Mr. Girl. Thank you. Item is now before the board for discussion. It's Mr. Salgado. Steve, do you want to give a quick overview on that?
Yeah, that's it. If you recall, this is for the $4 million bond that we talked about, is the the Baxter Road, and that it's a matching grant, essentially not to exceed. There was some flexibility, so we can actually purchase the bonds at a certain time whenever we need to, based on our interest rate that we have. So this just gives them authority for that. Mr. Chapman, is there anything else you want to add to that?
Steve?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, this is really what they call a parameters ordinance, which allows us to go forward and sell the bonds at a date from today, based on the interest rates and bond markets. We'll rely upon our financial advisor, Nat, to indicate when the best time to do that is. If you remember, we were originally going to sell these bonds back in March, and then the bond market fell apart. So the decision was made to go forward and do this. This is similar to the next ordinance that Mr. Salgado will bring in. It's a parameters ordinance. So this will give us some flexibility and do it at the best time for the county.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Salgado and Steve. Any questions? Mr. Fiducia?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is this the first reading of this ordinance? And if it is a first reading, could we suspend?
No, this would not. It's an ordinance, so it's not a first reading for this. Mr. Chapman.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe our board rules indicate that if it's an ordinance for the issuance of bonds, that it does not have to lay over.
Correct.
So that's why we can take action tonight.
So we don't have to go through the hoop of suspending. So it's right before us for action tonight. Any other questions or comments by board members? Seeing none, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? I do not hear or see any objections, so we will cast a yes vote for all members present. Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next item is an ordinance authorizing the issuance of not to exceed $2.6 million of general obligation refunding bonds, alternate revenue source, series 2020B. And I so move.
Got a motion by Mr. Salgado on the ordinance authorizing the issuance not to exceed 2.6 million of general obligation refunding bonds, series 2020B. May I have a second, please? Mr. Girl, again, thank you. Mr. Fiducia, thank you. Item is now before the board. Do you mind a quick overview as well, Mr. Salgado or Steve?
Sure. I'm going to yield to Mr. Chapman because this is relating to kind of some other bonds that we're kind of refinancing, but I would like him to address it. Thank you.
Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a bond issued, the 2010 C bonds that were issued back in 2010 to acquire the health department building at 555 North Court. The financial advisor originally looked at this issue and determined that based on the interest rates back in February and March, we could save probably in the neighborhood of $100,000 by refunding. Is basically similar to a refinancing of a loan. Again, with the bond market kind of bottoming out, again, this is a parameters ordinance that we'll go forward with it once the bond market's back in place and we can actually have the savings that we're looking at.
Thank you very much, Steve. Any questions by board members? I don't see or hear any. So with that, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? I do not hear or see any objection, so I will ask the clerk to cast a yes vote for all members present. Thank you very much. With that, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next item is an ordinance imposing a special retailer's occupation tax for mental health pursuant to the authority granted in Chapter 55, Act 5, Section 5-1006.5 of the Illinois Compiled Statutes, and this is to be laid over.
Okay, great. We have that in for layover this evening. I think that was a cleanup of a prior item. Mr. Girl, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make a motion to suspend the rules on this.
We got a motion by Mr. Girl to suspend the rules, and that would be on item 4, the ordinance imposing the special retailer's occupation tax for mental health pursuant to the authority granted by Chapter 55. May I have a second on the motion to suspend? Mr. Fiducia on the second. The motion, a second to suspend the rules, which would allow us to take separate action this evening, is before the board. Any quick discussion? Seeing none.
Yeah,
Oh,
just
go ahead,
real quick, it's a formality from the revenue, Illinois revenue. They wanted some language to align. So it's just a cleanup kind of type of thing with the language. That's it.
Yep, I understand that as well to be true. Thank you. Mr. Chapman indicated that as well. So the item before the board is to suspend the rules. Yes vote suspends the rules, no vote leaves it here. Are there any board members who are opposed to suspending the rules? Seeing none, we will cast a yes vote for all members present. We've now suspended the rules. Mr. Salgado.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So I move to approve the ordinance imposing the special retailers occupation mental health pursuant.
Okay, we got a motion by Mr. Salgado on the ordinance imposing the retailer's occupation tax for mental health. I may have a second. Mr. Girl, thank you. Mr. Neighbors, thank you. Item is now before the board. Again, this is a cleanup, an administrative cleanup, in Steve working with, I believe, the state on just making sure language was consistent. Nothing beyond that. Any discussion by board members or comments? Seeing none, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? Seeing none and hearing no objection, I will ask the clerk to cast a yes vote for all members present. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our last item is a resolution adopting fiscal year 2021 budget policy, and I so move.
We have a motion by Mr. Salgado on the resolution adopting the fiscal year 21 budget policy. May I have a second? Second by Mr. Grohl. Thank you. Motion a second on the 2021 budget policy is now before the board for discussion or comment, questions, anything like that.
Yeah, just
yes, sir, Mr. Salgado.
Yeah, just real brief. This is a yearly thing as for the yearly budget process that we are. There's some dates, so I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Chapman to give us a little bit, just a brief summary, but it just lays out the foundation essentially of what, how to, forecast what we're forecasting for the budget for next year, and laying out some dates, milestones that we need to meet in order for us to get prepared for that budget for 2021. So I'll hand it over to Steve if he wants to add more clarity or some quick summary. It's up to him.
Steve?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This particular budget policy is something similar to what was approved last year by the board. Kind of sets forth certain parameters in terms of what we're trying to accomplish in the budget, dates, assumptions, things such as that. Obviously, we've talked already about the impact of the COVID in terms of the fiscal year 2020 budget, and if those assumptions come true. But at the same time, we have to start looking at fiscal year 2021. We have to have a budget approved by the end of September. So this will be a task over the summer that'll have to be taken care of. So this just gives us some guidelines to move forward.
Any discussion by board members on the budget policy for the upcoming fiscal year? Seeing none, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? Hearing and seeing none, I will ask the clerk to cast a yes vote for all members present. Thank you very much, Clerk Amau. And then I'll turn it back over to Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There was an item ordinance to modify the 2019 property tax late penalties. We had a first draft, so I just want to give clarity on that. That's why we're not pushing forward at this point in time. But we had discussion on that. It's still being drafted. We're hoping to send out a press release potentially to the the taxing bodies to kind of address some of the questions that they might have and move forward and hopefully have some sort of ordinance applying to that, the tax late penalties, and hopefully vote on it at our last board meeting. So more to come on that, and just keep an eye on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado. Next item of business, Zoning Committee, Mr. Webster.
All right, here we are. Zoning Committee has 2 items on there for taking action on this evening. Number 1 is 202-20. It's a map amendment to rezone 1.31 acres from ag priority to CC community commercial. This was approved by Zoning Board of Appeals unanimously and likewise by Zoning Committee. And so I would move to approve this one.
We got a motion by Mr. Webster on item 1 under zoning Z0220 map amendment regarding rezoning. Second by Mrs. Crosby. Thank you. Item is now before the board. Any discussion or questions? Seeing none, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? Hearing and seeing none on that, we'll cast a yes vote for every member present. Motion passes unanimously. Mr. Webster.
Thank you. Next one, Z0320, net map amendment to rezone 1.12 acres from rural residential district to the CN neighborhood commercial district. And this one likewise came from Zoning Board of Appeals, unanimous, and Zoning Committee unanimous approval as well. So therefore, I would move to approve both.
Okay. So we got a motion by Mr. Webster on Z0320 map amendment to rezone. May I have a second, please? Second by Mr. Butita and Mrs. Crosby. Item 2 is now before the board, Z0320. Any discussion on this item? Seeing none, are there any board members opposed to this motion? Hearing and seeing none, motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Webster.
Yeah, the third thing that's on there, this was the resolution directing the Zoning Board of Appeals to conduct a public hearing on certain unified development ordinance amendments regarding permissible uses in select residential districts. I would refer this back to committee, so I need a second on that.
We got a motion by Mr. Webster to send this back to committee. Mr. Fiducia and Mrs. Crosby on the second. A motion is second to send this back to committee. Any discussion on that? Seeing none. Are there any board members opposed to sending this back to committee? Okay, we'll go ahead and send this back to committee. We'll ask the clerk to put down a unanimous vote on sending item 3 back to committee. Thank you very much, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Chairman. That's all I really have except to say that because we are in the, I don't know, in this condition that we're in, I guess, it's hard to say when Zoning Board of Appeals is going to be able to conduct another hearing, because those are public hearings that require testimony from either applicants or objectors. And so I don't know when they'll be able to get together, with the rules being that not more than 10 people can meet. And it's pretty difficult to do that when you have 7 committee members, then you have 2 staff members, and then you have a state's attorney. That's 10 right there. And so the ZBA doesn't have anything that they can push forward, so consequently, we won't have anything to follow for who knows how long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Next item of business, Economic Development Committee, Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have no report tonight.
No report. Thank you very much, sir. Operations Administrative Committee, Mr. McDonald.
We have no report tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Public Works Committee, Mr. Tassoni. Mr. Tassoni. Oh, there he is. You there? You there, Dave? We're going to come back to Mr. Tassoni momentarily. Personnel and Policy, excuse me, Public Safety Committee, Mr. Booker. Sorry about that. How dare I skip our beloved Public Safety Committee. Mr. Booker.
Got a little concern there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got two items to bring forward to the board tonight, both resolutions. And resolution number one is approving the subcontractor agreement for the Department of Justice Violence Against Women fiscal year 15 Justice for Families grant. It is a grant. I did receive clarification that it was a 5-year grant that we received in fiscal year 15, and it is something that needs to be approved every year. So that was just a point of clarification, and I move for its approval.
We got a motion by Mr. Booker on the resolution approving the subcontractor agreement for the Department of Justice Violence Against Women fiscal year 15 Justice for Families grant. May I have a second, please? A second by Ms. Butita and Mrs. Gorel. Thank you. Item is now before the board for discussion or comment. Seeing none, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? Hearing and seeing none, we're going to ask the clerk to cast a yes vote for all members present. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The other resolution, another win-win for Winnebago County, is a resolution authorizing the execution of a first extension of agreement between Winnebago County, Illinois, and Remedies Renewing Lives for the Domestic Violence Mentor Court Technical Assistance Grant. I move for its approval.
We got a motion by Mr. Booker on the resolution authorizing the first extension of agreement between the county and Remedies Renewing Lives for Domestic Violence. May I have a second, please? Again, Mr. Butita, thank you very much. Item is now before the board for discussion. I don't see any or hear any questions, so I will, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? Seeing none, I'll ask the clerk to cast a yes vote for all members present. Thank you very much, Clerk Gumau. Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. And I just received an email from Mr. Kerlinkus recently about the agreement with McChesney Park. Is that something we need to discuss tonight or hold over to for our next Public Safety Committee meeting? Mr. Kerlinkus?
Dave, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I sent out was in response to a phone call that I received from the McChesney Park Village Attorney. So I drafted that and sent it over to everybody so that it would be before the next committee meeting of yours, Mr. Booker, and then that would probably be voted on at the board meeting 2 weeks from tonight.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Kerlinkus.
Just has to be done before the end of May.
Ah, yes. Okay, we'll get that done. We'll get that completed. Mr. Chairman, that completes my report.
Thank you very much. I'm going to back up and go back to Mr. Tassoni, Public Works Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess my Zoom decided to close out or something at that time. We have no report at this time. Our next scheduled meeting is Tuesday, the 19th, 5 p.m. on Zoom. Thank you.
All right. We'll look forward to it, Mr. Tassoni. Thank you very much. Next item of business, we'll go down to letter G, Personnel Policy Committee, Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Personnel and Policies has one item to bring forward tonight. That is a resolution authorizing Gallagher Pharmacy Consulting Services to conduct a pharmacy benefits management, procurement, revenue, and contract negotiations effective January 1st, 2021, and I would so move.
Second.
We got a motion by Mr. Fiducia on the resolution authorizing Gallagher, and a second by Mrs. Gorel. Item is now before the board. Steve, do you want to give a quick update?
Mr. Chairman, I would defer to Deb Crozier, who's on the line, I believe.
Deb, you want to give a quick, just a high-level overview so everybody's clear on the floor here?
I will do that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is for a pharmacy consulting service proposal with Gallagher. The prescription contract has gotten extremely complicated over the years. What they would do is they would take our data for the last 12 to 24 months. They would develop the request for proposal. They would evaluate the proposal. They would help us with the finalist selection and assessment, and then they would help us along, of course, with the state's attorney's office to review the final contract. This would involve contracting, auditing, pricing, underwriting, rebate negotiations. So there's a lot that goes into this. Our prescription spend last year for calendar year 2019 was $2.4 million. Our rebates were $799,000 that we received back.
Okay, thank you. Any questions or comments by board members? Yes, sir, Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to reiterate too that if there's going to be any charges to the county, what they're going to do is they're going to roll it over to the companies that get the contract. So this will cost the county nothing.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion or comments by board members? Seeing none, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? Seeing and hearing none, I will ask the clerk to cast a yes vote for all members present. Thank you very much. Item passes unanimously. Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That concludes our report.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Fiducia. Next item of business, any unfinished business by board members? Seeing none, I'll move on to new business. We have 3 different boards we're making appointments to, a total of 4 appointments before the board this evening. The Chicago Rockford International Airport. We have an appointment and a reappointment, appointment of Mike Shabloski replacing Pat Deary, and then Tom Del Santo reappointed. Point of note, these are 3-year appointments. These 2 particular positions have overrun into this term by 2 years. So it's a 3-year appointment, typically 5, in this case would be 3-year appointment. The second is the reappointment of Tom Ewing to the Winnebago County Board of Review. The substantial amount of time that goes into Board of Review work is reflective in the stipend salary you'll see there on the right under letter B. And the third is the Winnebago County District 4 appointment, and the Republican caucus in their meeting, it is my understanding, talking to Mr. McDonald, selected after much discussion Brad Lindmark to fill the vacant seat, which that would be a short appointment of May 2020, effective basically immediately until the new board is seated. So with that, we have these items before the board under new business. Mrs. Crosby.
I'd like to move to suspend the rules to approve all the appointments.
So we have a motion by Mrs. Crosby to suspend on all 3, the airport, the Board of Review, and the District 4 motion. And I got a second by Mr. Girl.
Roll call.
Okay, we can do that. And a second by Mr. Butita as well. So with that, we have a motion and a second on suspension of the rules. Any questions on suspending the rules? Yes, Mr. Webster.
You got to unmute. Unmute, Jim.
Go ahead.
Unmute.
Okay. I would like to separate each and every one of these as a singular vote on each one.
So the request is to separate out, we can separate that out. That's absolutely no problem. So that we're still motioning, or still before the board is to suspend the rules or not to suspend the rules. So what the request is by Mr. Webster is to separate out the items that are collectively together and to deal with suspending the rules separately. Any discussion on splitting these out?
I have.
Yeah, Mrs. Red.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. My questions and my discussion is on the Airport Board Authority position. I sent an email to you and to each of the board members. You should have gotten it today. And I got a really, really nasty text message from, it said Mike Dunn on it, and I'm going to share it with the media. In fact, some of you have, I wasn't able to send it to all of you because of the time, but I would like for that position, for the seat for the airport board to be held over until the new chairman takes his or her seat. Because it makes no sense what I see going on. And for Mr. Dunn to respond to me in this way, he called me stupid and some other things. I didn't respond to his text message. And I don't know if this is his phone number, but I'm going to look into it. I'm going to ask that this be laid over and that position not be seated tonight.
The motion before the board is to suspend the rules to allow us to vote this evening.
I don't want that to happen.
Yeah,
So what I need I'm going to make a motion that that position be held over. The rules not be suspended, because I need to get this information out that I have. And so we can see what we're working with.
Point of order.
Hold on, Mr. Red, really, hold on 1 second. We have a point of order from Mr. Fellers.
We have a superseding motion in the suspension we have to act on first.
Okay.
So what you're suggesting, if I understand your point of order, is that we need to vote up or down on whether or not to suspend the rules before we would take a separate action of a layover? Is that, if we don't suspend the rules, it does lay over. If we do suspend the rules, then it's before the board for action this evening.
Mr. Chairman, I just got an email. Mr. Kelly can't be online. Maybe Gus can help him out.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Gus, if you're on, if you could help Mr. Kelly get back connected.
I've been trying to give him a hand. He did get on via voice calling in, and he dropped off, and now he doesn't answer the phone.
Okay.
So I'm
Give
doing
him
my
another shot.
best to get him connected, but I can't get a hold of him.
Okay, understood. Thank you very much. So the item before the board is to suspend the rules. We can take action on any other requests after that. Mr. Webster asked for us to split out suspending the rules on a per person basis, which we can happily do. We don't need to take further action. We can just split that out individually. So what we have is we have a motion to suspend the rules, and the motion to suspend the rules is on the airport appointments, and we've had a second on that. Any discussion about suspending the rules? Yes, Mr. Arena.
I just thought, in light of what was just said about the Mr. Kelly not being able to participate in the meeting any longer, if there's no compelling reason to vote on these tonight, maybe we should just let them lay over, because, you know, he may want to be able to participate. Just a thought. I don't see a reason to rush it if we don't need to.
I think the timing element from my perspective is that we had a longstanding board member who was very involved on the financial side, Pat Deary, longtime executive, leave the board effective May 1st. And the idea that there's 2 board meetings with the airport between now and our next board meeting, the fact that there are number 1 economic engine, the fact that my appointment will not change with the 2 individuals, I would very much ask for the board to take action this evening so we can move past that. Be happy when we deal with whether or not to take action tonight after this vote and talk about the merits to address any things in Mrs. Red's letter. Mr. Fiducia, the item right now is whether or not to suspend the rules.
I just don't want technology to hamper anything. If Mr. Kelly's not online, I don't think that's fair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fiducia. Any other comments? Yes, Mr. Fellers.
Yeah, I believe Mr. Kelly is back online. I see his name down the corner.
I'm here.
The resurrection of Mr. Kelly, he is back with us. So the motion, or what's before the board, is to suspend the rules on the airport appointments, plural, Mike Shablasky, Tom Del Sano, so we could take action this evening. That was initially Mrs. Crosby's motion. Any other comments? And we're really focused on whether or not to suspend the rules, not whether or not you would vote up or down on either of those 2 candidates. Again, with that, I will ask the clerk to call the roll. A yes vote suspends the rules. A no vote leaves it here this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Mr. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Fiducia,
No.
Mr. Gurl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
No.
Mr. Hoffman,
No.
I believe that was a no.
Correct.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
No.
Mrs. Red,
No.
Mr. Salgado,
No.
Mr. Schultz,
No.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster.
No.
Mr. Westcott is still absent.
No, I'm here.
Okay, Mr. Westcott,
No.
thank you. Mr. Arena,
No.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, that's 9 yes, 10 no to suspend.
Got it. So the motion to suspend fails. We'll move on to our next item. And that is the appointment of Mr. Ewing to suspend the rules.
Yes.
Any questions on suspending the rules on the District 4 appointment? That's Mr. Schultz.
Yeah, I'll be brief. You know, my position on this is known to most of you. The precinct committeeman unanimously in District 4 put forward Mr. Mike Zintak. the Republican committee followed longstanding practice to honor.
Point of order. Are we on number B or number C?
We're on B and C together, so it's appropriate for
B and C
Mr.
together. I thought a motion was made by Mr. Webster to separate out all of these.
That's right.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a fair point. We have, we should act on Tom Ewing at that, and I apologize, Mr. Schultz, that's my procedural error.
I'll just reserve my comments. Thank you.
Yep.
We need to vote to suspend the rules still on item B. We've not suspended them yet.
Yep. Mrs. Crosby, do you want to pull back your motion on suspending the rules and take action in 2 weeks?
No.
You want to?
Do not want to withdraw. So I would like to vote on Ewing tonight, and I would like to vote on Lindmark tonight.
Okay. So the item before the board is Tom Ewing. That's been motioned and seconded. Is there any other discussion on suspending the rules? Seeing none, we will ask the clerk to call the roll. A yes vote suspends, a no vote leaves it where it's at.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Mr. Fellers,
Yes?
Mr. Fiducia,
No.
Mr. Girl.
Yes.
That was a yes.
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
No.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
No.
Mrs. Red,
No.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz,
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes. Yes.
Mr. Arena,
Yes.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, that's 15 yes, 4 no on the suspension of the rules.
Okay, thank you. We've suspended the rules on the Tom Ewing reappointment, which is item B, the Winnebago County Board of Review. That is now before the board for discussion. I'd entertain a motion. Mr. Girl on the motion, Mrs. Crosby and Mr. Booker on the second. The reappointment of Tom Ewing is now before the board. Any discussion by board members?
Yes.
Yes, Mrs. Gorel.
Tom's been a real, he's worked so hard for our Board of Review for the last several years. He is chairperson of that review board. He's done an excellent job. He puts in lots of hours. If any of you come by the administration office at nighttime, you will see not only he, but there's 2 others or 3 others that are also putting in lots of hours for the Board of Review to make sure the taxes to the tax people are fair. And yes, I would endorse Mr. Tom Ewing to continue on. Thank you.
Any other discussion by board members? Seeing none, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? Seeing none, I will ask the clerk to call the yes vote for all members present. Thank you very much. Motion passes unanimously. Next item is the suspension of rules for the Winnebago County District, Board District 4. That's for Brad Lindmark filling the David Reimer seat. Mrs. Crosby.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to withdraw my motion at this point, and I'm requesting with the grace of John Butita, that he withdraws his second.
So we're going to motion a second to withdraw, so that item then would lay over. You're pulling back your motion to suspend the rules. Okay.
Correct.
So then the item would lay over to the next board meeting.
Correct.
We will let you withdraw your motion. With that, are there any other items under new business by board members? Seeing none?
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mrs. Reddick.
I've received several letters from small business people who own campgrounds. And they are requesting that they be allowed to reopen in this third phase. So can that be included in what you guys are working on?
Absolutely.
I can make a note to have, to look into that.
Thank you.
Yeah, that needs to be done.
Any other new business by board members? Yes, Mr. Webster.
Mr. Webster, you're on mute.
If there is no new business, I would move to adjourn.
We got a motion to adjourn by Mr.